We started the day by acknowledging how ideas are the currency of the present and how debates help us have discussions and deliberations. We believe debating forces us to think from various angles, understand them as entirely as we can, and then try to convince the rest of the room of our viewpoint. And this is how we end up having more ideas to transform our society. Someone once quoted, "The best part about the stones in my path is that when I cross them, they become milestones." The achiever of many such milestones, Sri Sanjay Srivastav, were an alumnus of our college who brought accolades through his intellect, eloquent speeches, bringing into existence Mecca, being one of the most popular prime ministers of the student parliament, by becoming the topper of the university and then the 1977 batch of Indian Administrative Services, and served the government in different capacities for 20 years. He believed in the power of having a strong conscience. And today we take a small step in doing justice to his legacy of academic brilliance, oratorical skills, and pursuit of excellence by preserving the spirit and sanctity of this activity. With that, once again, we welcome you all to the third edition of the annual Sanjay Srivastav Memorial Debate. Now, as we move on for the final round, it is my honor to introduce the guest of honor for this debate. Our first judge and guest of honor is Ms. Neeta Chaudhary. She is an alumna of Lady Shri Ram College, during which time she mastered the art and craft of debating. Her professional career as a member of the Indian Administrative Service saw her work on a host of issues like public policy, rural economy, disaster management, women and child development. We are delighted to have you join us today, ma'am. Our second judge and guest of honor is Mr. Ranjan Chatterjee. It is our honor to welcome an alumnus of our Hindu college. His time as a member of the Indian Administrative Service was defined by work across a multitude of sectors: aviation, education, finance, environment, defense, planning commission, to name a few. He also served as an expert member on the National Green Tribunal. He is also an adjunct professor at NLU Guwahati. Presently, he is working with Impulse NGOs against human trafficking and exploitation. Thank you, sir, for joining us today. Our third guest of honor, who will join us later today, is Shri Shakti Sinha. Mr. Sinha is the director of Atal Bihari Vajpayee.
Anushka, I'm joined. I'm listening to you. I've joined and I'm listening to you, Anushka.
Thank you so much, sir, for joining. Shri Shakti Sinha, Mr. Sinha is the director of Atal Bihari Vajpayee Institute of Policy Research and International Studies, MS University, Vadodara, Delhi School of Public Policy and Governance, University of Delhi. He is a distinguished fellow at India Foundation. Mr. Sinha was the former director at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library and was part of the Indian Administrative Service from the 1979 batch. Thank you, sir, for joining us. Thank you, everyone. Now, as we move forward, I would like to pass on the mic to the chair for this round, Spriha.
Thank you so much, Anushka. I hope I'm audible to everybody.
Yes, Spriha, you are audible.
Great. A very good afternoon and our warmest greetings to all the participants, judges, and guests present here with us today. We at Hindu are extremely grateful to you for being a part of the third annual Sanjay Srivastav Memorial Debate today. Though the event is entirely online this time, we sincerely hope the debating experience is something you can look back upon and cherish in the future. That being said, this pandemic has been something no one ever thought we'd have to face collectively. But what has been more debatable is the way the problems arising out of the same have been dealt with. Therefore, we feel that the motion of this round is extremely pertinent and significant to contributing to the discourse on healthcare management, not only in India, but all over the world, in a manner of solidarity and mutually beneficial coexistence. Thus, without further ado, the motion of the final round of the third annual Sanjay Srivastava Memorial Debate is: this House believes that international organizations have failed the world in their pandemic response. The proposition and opposition will be defending and opposing this motion respectively. I wish all the debaters the very best for the same. Before we formally begin the round, I'd also like to take this opportunity to reiterate the rules once again. Each speaker will have 3 minutes of speech time. At the end of 3 minutes, interjectors can raise their hand via the Zoom raise hand feature to ask their questions or indicate the same in the chat. The chair will be calling on the interjector to unmute their mic and ask the question. Speakers, please note you can only ask one question and counter questioning is not allowed. Thus, the speaker will also be expected to answer the question in 1 minute, which goes without saying. Please keep your questions and answers brief and precise. Also note that each speaker is only allowed one interjection, while speakers can ask more than one interjections for different participants that will be taken into consideration on the discretion of the chair. Speakers are not allowed to ask questions to other speakers who are on the same side of the motion as they are. Simply, this means that proposition speakers cannot question other proposition speakers, and speakers from side opposition cannot question the other members of the opposition. Speakers are also highly requested to please adhere to the time limits and not exceed the time any more than 10 seconds, because judges are requested to not consider anything the speakers say after the stipulated time has elapsed. Informally, the speakers are also requested to give a brief countdown before they begin their speeches so that they're timed accurately. That being said, now I'd like to call upon the very first speaker for today, the proposition speaker from Miranda House, Gauri G. Gokul, to begin the debate.
Am I audible and visible?
Yeah, you're audible and visible.
All right. So, all right. I will start in 3, 2, 1. Panelists, 1 year into this pandemic, and we are right back at where we started. Mortality rates are skyrocketing invariably. Millions and millions have lost their lives. Millions more have lost their livelihood. And we believe in this situation, the response of international organization has failed in this regard. An adequate response in this situation would have been one that would have prevented this pandemic from becoming so long drawn, so lethal and widespread. And we believe that if these organizations had acted up in arms from the initial phase itself, so much of monumental damage could have been prevented in terms of global health and global community as well as global economy. And we provide to you 2 constructives. First, misinformation and lack of research. We see that as early as January 2020, when COVID-19 was recognized as an epidemic in China, WHO went on to release could not conduct proper researches and went on to release statements that quoted the Chinese government's limited research word by word, and they even went on to say that this pandemic does not spread by person-to-person contact, which turned out to be one of the biggest lies of all time. And this is in a scenario when these individual researchers worldwide were unanimously arguing that no, it does spread. None of that was taken into heed. Secondly, we see that a full-fledged COVID response in terms of a COVID protocol was released as late as June 25th, 2020, which was well into the pandemic. The world was already incurring impacts of it, and the world was already struggling with the pandemic. It was a late response. Thirdly, we tell you in a misinformation, right? We already saw how countries worldwide, especially like China, India, USA, Brazil, etc. So misinformation being propagated by their governments themselves in order to take advantage of the political mileage, advantage of the political vote bank in order to marginalize minority communities. And none of this was ever regretted or ever called out by any of the international organizations. No country-specific warnings, no country-specific regrets or statements were ever released. And we believe this would have had a significant impact simply because these are organizations that people believe a lot in and invest themselves in, especially for their health is concerned. So an international organization calling out individual governments would have made a large impact in mitigating these harms, and none of that was ever considered. So secondly, we talk about vaccine diplomacy. We tell you vaccine is currently the new tool of neo-colonization, where the world is currently divided into two camps. One of the Western camp where vaccination is provided by US and the European Union, and the other where vaccination is provided by Russia and China. And it is an extremely hostile situation where the two camps are pitted against each other. We also tell you, when these third world countries depend on hegemons for vaccination, this is a neo-political debt trap. We already have examples of what happens when you give access to hegemons to your country, especially in third world countries that are so rich in resources. We have historical examples of exploitation followed by colonization. We tell you this could have been mitigated to a large extent if these organizations like WHO or European Union had undertaken their protocol of welfare and ensure to a large extent equal distribution, at least to some extent, to these third world countries. This could have been mitigated to a large extent. Therefore, we're very proud to propose and argue that they have failed in every sense. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that fine speech, Corey. Are there any interjections? Or participants, can you please raise your hand? If there are any other interjections, you can please put them in the chat box. Right, seeing none, we move on. Thank you so much for your speech, Corey. I welcome the second speaker, Kamal Koli Majumdar from Miranda House, to speak against the motion.
Am I audible and visible? If I could just get a confirmation if I'm both audible and visible. All right, thank you. Before I start, can I just ask, it has to do with the rebuttal question. So if somebody doesn't get a rebuttal question, do they get full marks in that portion of the score sheet?
In the case of there not being any rebuttal questions, since rebuttal would be one of the things that would figure in the judgment of the judges, the speaker would be viewed favorably if there aren't any questions. That's why we encourage everyone to ask questions.
All right, thank you. That clarifies it. Okay, I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. A very good afternoon, panel. The motion before the House today is this House believes that international organizations have failed the world in their pandemic response. And I will have a threefold speech. In the first half of my speech, I'm going to tell you what exactly is an adequate pandemic response and how much can we expect from international organizations. Why is this so important in this debate today? Because international organizations like the United Nations, like the ASEAN, like the SAARC, like the EU, all of these depend on the voluntary involvement of the countries in these organizations. And some of the hallmarks of these organizations are two things. Firstly, to respect the sovereignty of the member nations, and secondly, non-interference in their internal matters. A lot of the measures surrounding the coronavirus pandemic has to do with internal measures within a country, whether it's mandating masks, mandating lockdowns, mandating curfews, mandating social distancing measures, and thus, while the WHO can and has released guidelines, they simply do not have the mechanisms to enforce it. That is how it is and has been with international organizations historically. Thus, we cannot expect for them to enforce or publicly call out countries if they do something wrong, because that is simply not in the purview of the mechanism of international organizations. Now that I have adequately told you what is not in the purview of international organizations, I will go ahead and I will tell you a couple of positive impacts that have come through because of the World Health Organization and the UN. Firstly, we have mitigating misinformation. So the speaker came up and talked about how a lot of misinformation was spread, right? However, what we can see now today is the amount of mitigating measures that have been taken when it comes to misinformation. You post something which has the word COVID in it on any sort of social media site, and directly it links you back to the WHO guidelines page on the pandemic. And that is why we tell you it plays a large role in mitigating misinformation. Secondly, we talk about UN bodies and the work that they have done, right? We have the UNDP, we have UN Women, we have UNICEF that have worked in the third world countries and have given hope to the marginalized communities who have been disproportionately affected by the coronavirus pandemic. Secondly, we have the declaration of the international health emergency. This happened on 30th January 2020, which I'd argue is very, very prompt, considering the fact that there was a lot of misinformation from China, a lack of information from China, and thus a date of 30th January to declare an international health emergency is very, very prompt on part of the World Health Organization. Lastly, what is being really praised, what the UN is really being praised for, is its COVAX measure, is its partnership with COVAX, which is the largest vaccine making facility, to ensure that there is proper production of vaccines and to combat this sort of vaccine hegemony that you will see proposition speakers talk about, right? And that is why it's not just the World Health Organization, it is also regional international bodies like the ASEAN and the EU that have released guidelines, that have released charters of what their countries should be doing and how countries should go about as a response, right? So panel, what we see today is actually a very coordinated international response to the coronavirus pandemic. And thus, what is the burden of side proposition is to tell us what exactly is this metric of failure, because what we see is a coordinated response. Why should this failure, whatever has happened, be attributed to international organizations when I've already told you that international organizations simply lack the mechanism to enforce these? Thank you very much. Very proud to oppose.
Thank you so much for that speech. I see we have one interjection from Deepan from Hansraj. Yeah, please go ahead. You can unmute yourself and ask the question.
Yeah, am I audible?
Loud and clear.
Yeah. Congratulations on a really good speech. My question to you is, you said that calling out isn't within the purview of the United Nations or the WHO interchangeably, but Tedros Adhanom, who is the chief of WHO, had in their report of 2020 December called out Pakistan, Taiwan, and Brazil. So don't you think this selective calling out is a disadvantage of these international organizations that they should be held accountable to?
Exactly, that is my point, right? So international organizations, and I've already told you the way and the nature in which they function. There is also very obvious bends that international organizations have, and thank you for allowing me to elaborate on it because of your question. These international organizations, especially when it comes to the UN and the WHO, have a sort of Western hegemony on it, right? And they also are, their hands are tied in multiple spaces where they cannot take concrete action or go ahead and literally tell countries what to do or supply vaccines to countries, right? And that is why we tell you to attribute this blame to an organization or organizations whose hands are tied, who do not have the mechanism to go ahead and enforce the guidelines that they put out, is absolutely wrong, and it's a problem solution mismatch. Thank you for helping my case.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your speech. Before we move on, I'd just like to make a quick request to all the teams. In case you're asking interjections, please refrain from raising your hands. It's literally not possible for me to see it when the screen is being shared. Just put the interjections in the chat box and we can take it from there. Right, that being said, I'd welcome the second team, the second speaker of Proposition, Surbhi Chavan from Xavier's Mumbai.
Hi, am I audible and visible?
Yeah, you're audible and visible.
All right, I will just start giving you a countdown. Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. As the coronavirus pandemic sweeps across the world, institutions founded decades ago to organize and manage coherent responses to global crises have failed in their fundamental objectives. The organization that stands out the most is the World Health Organization, which is charged with anticipating and alleviating international health insecurity. And we think the WHO has largely been abysmal in its responses and the way it handled the crisis. By the end of the speech, I will prove to you that the fundamental incompetence of the WHO at accomplishing these goals they were trusted with, regardless of what the reasons behind those were, and they have actually worsened the situation in some aspects, means that this organization has failed the world in its pandemic response. I'm very proud to stand in Proposition today. Two main arguments in the speech. Firstly, how has the WHO failed in preventing significant proportions of devastation that the coronavirus pandemic caused, right? I think fundamentally the warning system that the WHO put in place was failed, right? This is because the China and the WHO failed to act quickly and more forcefully at the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. So there needs to be an emphasis on China's lack of transparency early during the outbreak and the global health body's decision to wait until January of 2020, like end January 2020, to declare an international emergency, right? We think as early as December 2019, authorities in China reported like clusters of cases of pneumonia of an unknown cause. That is when Taiwan's CDC emailed the WHO a few hours later, restating the earlier Chinese report and requesting more information on it, right? Instead, the WHO ignored these earlier warnings. I think there were exclusive harms arising out of this. The system that the WHO functions on the basis of was supposed to be democratic, right? But they actively went ahead and showed a pro-China bias. They ignored Taiwan's alarms. The identification of this particular disease could have been done much earlier, right? I think imagine in India, if the lockdown had been done in February instead of March, where international travel also could have been stopped much earlier. I think the WHO had that like responsibility of giving out adequate signaling, which was very important, right? Because they failed to comprehend the veracity of this problem. I think this mistake literally was paid by people when they died in hospital ICU beds, where their loved ones couldn't even go ahead and visit them because they were too scared to contract that disease. The mistake resulted in economic losses of colossal proportions, right? I think a lot of this harm could have been prevented much earlier if the WHO's warning system had just functioned more efficiently, right? But I think they failed in that fundamental responsibility that they have. Secondly, I think the WHO's betrayal of trust of countries that are a part of it worsened the already strenuous international cooperation, right? I think it's true that international cooperation wasn't the best outside of the WHO, but the WHO acted somewhat like a negative catalyst in terms of worsening the outcome, right? Which is that when they went ahead and showed a pro-China bias, actively trusted countries which trying to actually go ahead and fulfill the functions that they were trusted with, right? The WHO went ahead and quoted federal government that China has controlled the outbreak, whereas everyone knows that the Chinese Communist Party never reveals true information because it is an authoritarian state, right? Which means this willingness of WHO to trust these problematic figures exacerbated the volatility that existed in international cooperation, which disincentivized countries to further cooperate, which led to that lack of trust exacerbating. And I think the situation just became much worse off. For all of these reasons, I'm very proud to propose.
Thank you so much for that speech. There are 2 interjections. Devashish from Nirma University can go ahead with his interjection.
WHO cannot work without cooperation of People's Republic of China in providing crucial information. In spite of that, they issued advisories and also worked in standardization of vaccines so that vaccines are not dangerous for the people. Can you comment on that?
I think even if the standardization of vaccines, right? I think there are still some vaccines that ended up being problematic when they weren't able to detect the appropriate vaccine to allocate for that particular strain of vaccine, which has led to lots of side effects for especially in developing countries and African nations and so on, right? But also if you want to talk about Chinese cooperation, I think it's true that international bodies operate on the basis of cooperation of their constituent countries, but that still means that WHO should have gone ahead and paid heed to the warnings that countries like Taiwan were already given as early as December, right? I think that blatant ignorance of those warnings led to this crisis being exacerbated, and all of those harms could have been prevented much earlier, as I explained to you in my speech. I think your POI was already answered in the course of my speech. Thank you for that. I'm very proud to propose.
Thank you so much, Surbhi. I'd like to invite the next speaker from opposition from St. Xavier's, Mumbai, Ritavrata Mitra. Please take the stage.
Hi, mic check. Is this audible?
Yeah, perfectly audible.
All right, 1 second. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. Good afternoon to all members of the panel. Firstly, an intuition pump, right? My CGPA is an 8. It could have been an 8.5. It could have been a 9. It could have been a 9.5. It could have been better. But that doesn't mean I've principally failed as a student. What governments had argued till now is that WHO's response could have been better, but they didn't prove what were the so overarching exclusive harms that literally made sure that it literally failed in its response. I think they had a higher burden to prove in terms of why it literally led to failure and not simply regret a few of the decisions that it took. Firstly, substantive matter. Firstly, I think in terms of the response of WHO or in terms of international organizations, that's mainly the ambit of this debate. I'm going to tell you why that was sufficient and why that was or to an extent why that was overarchingly significant. I think the first is that the amount of network systems that they have in terms of WHO or UNICEF, who have a huge amount of volunteers who go into places like Africa, where in Congo, WHO literally has set up the strategic response plan. Secondly, thirdly, because WHO was already fighting with diseases like Ebola, which means they already had a machinery and a volunteering administrative system in place to essentially get this through. But the fourth argument is in terms of funding, right? WHO and say, for example, UNICEF always work on the goodwill of people because people tend to trust them as international organizations. Their PR image is something that's great, which is more companies would want to associate with them, which means through this vast network, they could get a huge amount of funding and donations that could essentially come in, which means at that point of time, more corporations were likely to invest and more media organizations went abroad, and they could like essentially network with a lot of NGOs. All of this meant that the response in terms of dealing with the pandemic in the most vulnerable sections of the world, for example, in Africa, where on a comparative government side has to prove that what would have been, say, for example, if WHO or UNICEF hadn't worked, is literally non-existent simply because no other organization has incentives to go down in such vulnerable localities or communities such as the Congo. We think at that point of time, WHO did fulfill its burden. But secondly, in terms of messaging, right? If government wants to argue that you could have said it 1 month ago, I'm unsure as to what the direct benefit of that is, because I think on 30th Jan or like at the end of Jan, they declared it as a global pandemic to begin with. I think their argumentation is largely that your response wasn't sufficient and you kind of ignored Taiwan and so-called accused people. I think that is largely United States of America's rhetoric. Trump has been like accusing random things and he's literally pulled out the Paris Climate Accord. I don't think even Trump's accusations are gospel to begin with. In terms of WHO's messaging, I think like the protocols that it went out and said, the first organization to issue how you should conduct the RT-PCR test. So by telling like if your positivity rate is greater than 5%, you should test more. Like giving out a mortality rate that you should abide by. We think that systematic platforming that WHO gave allowed nations a platform and a benchmark to go ahead and predicate their responses based on that. We think that was an exclusive benefit. But finally, in terms of international cooperation and mediation, we think WHO is the only mediating platform through which you can call nations out. You have to call China out or call these out. You need a platform to begin with. You have to understand the problem. I think WHO, UNICEF, even if they were so-called accusedly biased by Trump, we still think you get a platform which on your side you literally don't through these international organizations, which is if we have discourse on our side to begin with, you can still call countries out. I think that's a mechanism in terms of the platform that you provide for those reasons insanely proud to oppose.
Thank you so much for that speech. I see 3 interjections. Yeah, Bhargav from ILS, you can go ahead with your interjection. Please unmute your mic and ask the question.
Yes, thank you very much for that speech. My question to you is that still large-scale issues which require cooperation, such as vaccine distribution or vaccine nationalism that's going on, require better international cooperation. And the same goes for global preparedness to address this situation in the first place. The point at which these situations were not there and we did not address vaccine nationalism, the international organizations have failed in their responsibility. Isn't that true? And why not?
I don't think that's true, because I can also counterposit that literally throughout my speech, as I mentioned, that WHO and UNICEF were significantly distributing vaccines and PPE kits to the most vulnerable parts of Africa, which no other government organization could have done. But secondly, in terms of your question, in terms of cooperation, I think WHO, sure, like it can, like at some point of time, there can be negative externalities, but that doesn't mean it doesn't provide a cooperative platform for you to engage upon. I think the only way nations are incentivized to cooperate, because you can go ahead and call them out in the UN, or the UN provides you a mechanism or a collective space to go ahead and raise your issues. I think that is an exclusive benefit on and of itself, and that's still in terms of distributing vaccines in Africa or caring about the most vulnerable. I'm pretty sure that WHO and UNICEF have fulfilled, like to an overarching extent, what they should have.
Thank you so much for that speech and that interjection. Calling upon the third team for today, Institute of Law, Nirma University, I'd like to call upon their first speaker, their proposition speaker, Akshit Mishra, to open the case.
That makes me properly visible and audible as well, right?
Yeah, perfectly.
I hope there's no echo in my voice.
I don't hear any. I think it's all good.
Thank you for confirming. Yeah. Starting in 3, 2, 1. If one has to agree with Donald Trump on something, one needs to also agree that there has been something extremely wrong in the world. The wrong here being inadequate, responsible, and insensitive response of the international organizations such as WHO, International Monetary Fund, and World Bank. The institutions and organizations hold monopoly over international policy, and they sit on massive reserves of money and organizational power, right? They also have resources which have connections and other kinds of powers. International community has provided these corporations with these powers by handing over their trust and resources alike. It's basically a contractual relationship, which ends up creating this absolutism that these particular organizations become responsible for all such duties. Therefore, in principle, they have a larger responsibility to dispense. At a point in time, they fail them, it's an absolute failure. Number one, what are the basics of professional management of pandemics, right? You need to have information, you need to have a timely response, and you also need to have aid be incapacitated. Let's talk about information. When credible and quick information and help comes to the timely response, these are better for framing implementing policy, right? This means that the information, when miscalculated and confused, can also cause confusion and chaos in the public, which means mistrust and also lack of straightforward examples, right? This means at all points in time, there was a virus rapidly growing from China, and despite all that intel that WHO had, they still failed in bringing on effective mechanisms of prevention. For example, banning flights from one state to another, or even creating standards of what needs to occur during this process, which means at all points in time, when the world was looking forward to WHO bringing remarks and was contingent on WHO for all that, they failed that principle. On a second idea of timely response, and this becomes the key, right? Because immediate shutdowns, implementation of social distancing norms, and restricted travel had to be advised or imposed. WHO and UN failed to convince the world order in doing so as well, which means that the late March, when things got out of hand, there were 4 months after COVID was first announced in China. This means at all points in time, this was a late response too. But on the idea of aid, right, we think when there is inequality, there is also the possibility of these powerful nations and capitalist countries going ahead and hiding their money. This means that IMF and World Bank, apart from issuing reports, did nothing to extend aid to African countries or Eastern Asian countries, which means at all points in time, they also failed in the process of providing aid to those who were thoroughly incapacitated in terms of medical infrastructure and historic disablement. But lastly, on vaccines, despite great deal of demands coming from the developing world on emerging markets of vaccines and how there's a need for making patents public, there was incapacity on part of WHO to go ahead and fight for the rights of these individual countries which are not capable of creating or manufacturing vaccines or getting them for themselves, to go ahead and garner that support for them. But rather than doing that, WHO simply went ahead and just surrendered to the idea of pharmaceuticals that are more powerful in kind and notion, right? This means, in conclusion, the international organizations have either been mute bystanders or active perpetuators of inequalities. This failure will further infuse distrust among the weaker nations against these international fronts, leading to massive blow to the international community and its efforts of cohesion. Interjection, please.
Thank you so much for your speech. There is one interjection from Ritubrata from St. Xavier's. Please go ahead.
Your argument on culpability was WHO had directly the information or the intel. Considering the Chinese Communist Party is known to not to reveal information out to the public, how can you guarantee and ascertain that WHO did have this information to put direct culpability on them?
At a point in time, there is a principle standing that basically makes you capacitated in terms of having the duty and principle of going ahead and being more investigative and actively indulge in the process of finding out why the problem exists in the first place. When you don't do it, you fail. At that point of time, we believe there is more than enough reason for determining whether WHO failed or not. And in this case, the culpability rests in WHO's ballpark, and we believe therefore they failed. And for all those reasons, very proud to propose.
Thank you so much for your speech. I would now like to call upon the opposition speaker from Institute of Law, Nirma University, Devashish Trivedi. Please take the stage.
I hope I'm audible and visible.
Yep, you are. Yeah.
All right. Just give me 5 seconds to refresh my memory. All right. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Whatever leaders like Donald Trump or proposition in this tournament have said ought to be taken with a hint of salt when it comes to how international organizations work. While responses may be slow, it cannot be considered to be inadequate, as very organizations we're talking about have done following things. First, prepare the entire world towards greater cooperation on aiding most vulnerable individuals when it comes to any disaster. This includes Red Cross, World Food Programme, UNHCR working tirelessly to procure aid material and develop basic infrastructure well ahead of any crisis. Number 2, the very existence of these organizations like WTO, WHO, and IMF enabled a system which allows standardized action towards global pandemic, which we couldn't have imagined in a world wherein none of these organizations would have existed. Yes, the world is not perfect, but this imperfect world allowed the developing world to negotiate for generic medicine at Doha negotiation rounds of WTO. It compelled WHO to issue standardized guidelines for health emergency responses, which worked as a checklist for many nations in terms of how they can respond to any pandemic whatsoever. And we saw IMF donating billions of dollars of birth aid relief to developing and underdeveloped countries on a condition that they develop a proper bare minimum infrastructure towards healthcare, education, etc. As far as the status quo is concerned, we have organizations like Global Alliance for Vaccine and Immunization procuring billions of doses of vaccines, ventilators, PPE kits, and other medical material for the developing world, where they are working in cooperation with all the actors involved in this crisis, even when developed world was hoarding these resources. We also have regional alliances like ASEAN, African Union, European Union working towards passing crucial information and techniques which allowed a lot of countries to develop local policies which help them tackle the pandemic. We also witnessed WHO creating basic safety certification standards for all the vaccines and medications being developed, without which false medicines like Coronil from Patanjali would have been sold globally very easily, affecting people in ways we simply cannot fathom because there was no scientific study done towards the same. We can blame these organizations all we want, but it must be understood that international organizations work on two principles: complementarity and cooperation. We cannot expect them to work efficiently without nations providing crucial information and willingness to cooperate. If a lackluster behavior is to be blamed on this pandemic response, it ought to be blamed on countries like China, Brazil, United States of America for taking nefarious actions, like China actively hiding crucial information about severity of the infection, USA withdrawing massive funding from WHO right before WHO could take action towards pandemic response. Even after that, WHO did initiate an investigation at the epicenter of the pandemic at Wuhan the moment it got the opportunity and permission of doing so by the Chinese authorities, which was done in last month. Hence, it can be concluded that response may have been slow, but it was never inadequate and never will be as long as countries willing to cooperate. These organizations are doing their job. We as individuals, nation state, are being too skeptical of their work. Allowing interjections now. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that speech. I see 3 interjections. I will take up the interjection from Survi from St. Xavier's. Please go ahead.
Yeah, just because the organizations are scampering to get things right now doesn't mean they didn't fail at the start. Also, USA withdrew the funding after WHO took a pro-China stance and just decided to buy whatever statistics China gave them, despite knowing that the CCP is going to give them like a problematic statistics. Engage with that.
Let me break this myth. There was never a pro-China stance when it comes to WHO taking actions. WHO created neutral guidelines for all the countries and also issued neutral certificates for all the vaccines. Side government have to take a long mile to go ahead and explain why exactly there was a pro-China stance, especially when WHO had its hand tied when CCP was not dishing out any information whatsoever. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Devashish. I'd like to call upon the 4th team for today, the proposition speaker for Hansraj, Deepansh Chaurani, to open the case.
All right, am I audible and visible?
Perfectly.
Yeah, I just set up a timer for myself as well, just to double check. All right, starting in 3, 2, 1. The COVID-19 pandemic is probably the biggest crisis humanity has faced in the 21st century, if not through the course of its history. Post-realization of which, we needed strong international cooperation as a response, but so far, international organizations have not been up to the task. The principle upon which this debate operates is pretty simple. Resolving collective action problems requires independent functioning of international organizations, along with the power of enforceability without over-interference among the member states. Except this was not how the international organizations ended up operating. This I will prove to you through a series of 3 major arguments. First argument, over-politicization of the response mechanism. We need to consider that the radio silence of the United Nations Security Council is just a reflection of how the deep divide inside the institution prevented any action. No country in the G20 stepped up to exercise the much required leadership, and it was only worsened by the rivalry between the US and China. But also it worsened it for the WHO, which for some reason has been the only institution anyone has so far talked about. We need to realize that it didn't just spoil things for everyone else. The WHO went ahead and put out a tweet on January 14th saying that there is no way that COVID can be transpired or transferred through human interaction. We think this claim was immensely understood that it was false, but since they were allegiant towards China, they went ahead with it anyway. Imagine if the WHO took notice of the information that was received from Taiwan or the captive doctors in China who reached out to the UN, how much destruction it could have saved the world. But more importantly, we come to the second argument, the declaration of the public health emergency of international concern, which I also call the FIC. The WHO should not have waited until January 22 to make the declaration. But secondly, it's about the term FIC itself. It's a much milder threat when you put it out into the society, right? People did never listen to the threat of the FIC. They only responded to it after you declared it as a global pandemic much later in mid-January. But thirdly, beyond the term, it is also about the process that you come through which the decision is taken. Initially, TEDOS convened a meeting wherein there were many medical professionals who decided that COVID is something that is not necessarily transpiring in nature, but then after a week, they went ahead and just flipped their position. We think that week could have been immensely instrumental in bringing about change. But the third argument is about how these organizations don't possess effective tools at this stage, right? The World Health Organization has functioned as a mere clearinghouse, and because of their allegiance to China, they have not been able to extract information, nor to enforce any power within any country. We need to realize that they went ahead and favored China when it imposed bans on products of other countries, but not in vice versa. In the European Union, it was a similar case. Ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, it's fair to say that we are witnessing in real time a paralyzed system of global cooperation, which opposition can't defend by giving us their past benefits like Red Cross, right? Because understand, if that was the case, then these are the same institutions which have repeatedly failed to protect life, like in Syria, on migrant rafts in the Mediterranean Sea, amidst forest fires in Australia, and now in global quarantines and ICUs in different states during the COVID pandemic. The international organization have always failed us.
Thank you so much for that wonderful speech. Are there any interjections apart from Devashish? Right, seeing none, Devashish, you can go ahead.
How can WHO ever breach any country's sovereignty, especially when it is a horizontal organization in the principles of international law?
Yeah, that's your question. So yeah, that's exactly the problem that we are going to hold these people accountable to, right? The limitation of the organizations in and of itself. The problem in the debate so far has been that we've been saying that it is due to the incapability of WHO to go ahead and call out the other countries that has led to the delaying of the problem in and of itself. We failed to acknowledge the role of WHO in this. They went ahead and took a passive stance right at the very outset, which failed to induce other countries to take preemptive measures. More importantly, we have no problem in WHO going ahead and creating laws and mechanisms that other countries have to mandatorily adhere to, right? They do so in security positions as well. They have asked the United States to interfere in different regions earlier due to security threats. We don't think WHO therefore should be an exception wherein you're facing a global threat of a pandemic. We think this principle can also at this stage apply to them, or at least in exceptional scenarios, they should be able to access this irrespective of whether or not it compromises your sovereignty, because it's for the protection of the people who live within your sovereign.
Right, thank you so much for that. Speakers, please take note of not exceeding your time limit by over a minute. That's something that can lead to you being marked negatively. That being said, I'd like to call upon the opposition speaker from Hansraj, Khushvardhan Demla, to present their case.
Hi, am I visible and audible apart from the screen thing?
Yeah, perfectly.
I'll start in 3. I'm also timing myself. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Ladies and gentlemen, if I bought Adani stock in March 2020, I would be a millionaire by now. Except at that point of time, I did not know the severity of the pandemic. I did not know what the future had for me. So if someone tells me now that I'm a failure because I did not know Adani stock was going to shoot up 3,000% in a year, that it cannot possibly be a failure, because the metric for what a success or a failure is, it is decided from information available at that time and not the present. The COVID-19 pandemic is probably the biggest public health crisis in living memory. The responses triggered has been multi-front, from data collection to testing and treatment. And on all these fronts, as nations increasingly looked inward, it was a global response led by international organizations that helped make the situation relatively better. A few clarifications. When we talk about international organizations, we not only talk about the WHO, but also organizations like Gavi, CEPI, and World Bank that have contributed immensely to this response. What is failure for organizations like these? Failure then becomes the inability of these organizations to fulfill their mandate and respond appropriately to issues faced by countries given available knowledge and resources. Two important questions. Firstly, what is the mandate of organizations like WHO and Gavi? They are advisory bodies which coordinate and direct international health response. They do not have authority over member nations and can only recommend action. Very important. Secondly, what would constitute an ideal pandemic response? An ideal pandemic response to COVID-19 would be one in which A, data and analysis is available freely and in a transparent manner. B, tests were made available in countries where there is shortage. C, funding and aid was provided. And D, vaccines were made available to even those who cannot afford or produce them. I will now show to you how these organizations not only fulfilled their mandate, but also, given resources and knowledge, had the ideal response to the pandemic. Firstly, data and accessibility. From the very beginning, the WHO has published data and updates on the virus on all platforms. I still get updates from WHO daily on my Facebook Messenger. For the large majority of countries that do not have organizations like the United States CDC, this data has been hugely helpful in figuring out a plan of action. With respect to resources, international organizations have again helped out with tests and funding. As early as February 2020, when tests were scarce in even developed countries, 40 and then 120 countries were supplied tests by the WHO. The World Bank has mobilized more than $160 billion to help countries navigate the economic consequences of the crisis. Most importantly, COVAX, formed by the CEPI, Gavi, and WHO, has supplied vaccines to over 100 countries where vaccines would not conventionally be available for the next few years. This is not sudden. WHO published a roadmap for coordinated efforts as early as March 2020. The proposition's accusations against international agencies come from an understanding that these organizations are some international authority who can get things done as per their whims and fancies. That could not be far from the truth, right? These organizations have to balance international interests, national interests, resource paucity, and coordinate multiple things without any real authority. As a result, given the constraints, the outcome, which has been commendable, absolutely cannot be termed as a failure. I feel it's very easy to just look at things in retrospect and complain. With that, I rest my case.
Thank you so much for that speech. Are there any okay, I see two interjections. Gauri from Miranda House can please go ahead with their interjection.
Thank you very much. Am I audible?
You are.
Yeah.
First of all,
No, you're not.
Right? So when you talk in a pandemic situation, we all
Gauri, your voice cracked in the beginning. If it's okay, can you just type in the interjection on the chat?
Can I repeat the question?
Yeah, you can go ahead and repeat the question once again. Please try.
Okay. So, all right. So initially, the speaker trivialized the matter by comparing it to stock market. Right? Let me break it down for you. When you talk about a COVID response, where there was already information existing in the status quo that it was already recognized as an epidemic in China, and mortality rates were skyrocketing at that time, and individual researchers across the world were telling you that this is going to be a very grave situation, and the mortality rates are very high, and in this particular pandemic. In what regard can you say that they were not able to grasp the whole situation? And if they were not able to grasp, they're nothing but a failure, especially since every minute a person dies, and in a pandemic response, time is money. How are you going to trade off human lives for stock market comparison?
If you go and look at the WHO timeline, the team went on the 31st of December, and on 10th January, they recognized that the novel coronavirus was the result of the pneumonia infection that has spread in Wuhan. However, I think it's very rational to say that if the moment someone goes ahead and sees that, hey, this pneumonia is spreading and it's restricted to a particular area, their first response isn't going to be, hey, listen, this is a global pandemic. Of course, despite that, they issued advisory, again, to the best of the research that was available. I don't think you can hold an organization responsible for scientific research that wasn't available at that point of time. Because again, this particular organization also coordinated data from 100 countries and conducted operations to ensure that data was published in real time and made available to all countries, right? So I don't feel like it's very fair to go ahead and say that, hey, science does not know this, but the WHO should know this because, well, China hides stuff. I don't feel like that's a rational conclusion at all in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I'd like to call upon the fifth team for today, the proposition speaker from the Shri Ram College of Commerce, Samika Singh, to please open her case.
So I'll begin. I'm audible and visible, right?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Okay, great. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. To start off with, I'd like to thank the panel for my time on the floor. Today, we're gathered here to discuss the failure of international organizations in their pandemic response. Firstly, allow me to define certain terms and set the ambit of the debate so as to properly contextualize the arguments I'll be putting forth through the course of my speech. International organizations are founded by the coming together of different nations as a world. We are all familiar with the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, and the World Health Organization. These organizations are formed with certain purposes to fulfill, with each organization having certain responsibilities of what they provide to member states, and in return also having certain expectations from these member states. Now, to set the scene in the status quo, the coronavirus pandemic is something that warrants no introduction. All of the people sitting in this virtual debate room today would have been sitting in an actual debate room debating something completely different had it not been for this pandemic. The pandemic has hit the entire world, but not equally. Several states have suffered and are suffering more than others. In light of this pandemic, what responsibilities do international organizations have to their member states? The World Health Organization, from the very onset of the pandemic, has been under the scrutiny of many. In January 2020, they failed to release important information which may have slowed down the initial spread of the virus. The organization was under fire for falling prey to undue and excessive Chinese influence and failing to hold China accountable for the sharing of data and information that could have potentially saved the lives of many. As the pandemic has progressed, the credibility of the organization has been called into question again and again. People have distrusted the information provided by them. The organization has failed to hold any member states accountable for sharing of data, conducting of research, or even taking care of the public in general by enforcing appropriate pandemic guidelines. In light of the shining ray of hope that vaccination brings, it is not just the WHO which is failing the people. Along with the WHO, you have the UN, the WTO, the EU, and several other organizations which fail here when they fail to ensure equitable distribution of the vaccine. Richer countries with smaller populations have stockpiled a large majority of the available supply of vaccines to face only the consequence of criticism. It is incredibly vital for international organizations to aim to ensure that during the pandemic response, the rich are not made better off at the cost of the lives of the poor. International organizations can aptly be described as the ideal scapegoat. They provide people with incomplete data and fail to provide any real mechanisms or processes by which they hold their member states accountable or fulfill their mandates. The UN has long been described as the best hope for peace and security, as well as the protection of human rights, for example. In a world that has been united to fight against the virus, where is the tangible aid that institutions like the UN have provided to people? In a world where these organizations can skirt their responsibilities by shifting the blame to the lack of action of the member states, what meaningful role can they play? Their role is to ensure that member states fulfill certain obligations, cooperate with one another, and level the playing field between richer and poorer countries. During the course of the pandemic, these organizations have fulfilled to complete or to finish their responsibilities. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that speech. Are there any interjections? Seeing none in the chat, and okay, fine, I see one. Anyone else? Yeah, Ritupati from Xavier's, you can go ahead.
Since we've given you reasons on the op bench in terms of how WHO or UNICEF has been coordinating in terms of helping the most vulnerable, why do you think that this cooperation didn't exist? Or in like if the WHO doesn't exist, what alternative exists on your side to make sure that this platform is something that you get?
So the debate is not about providing an alternative mechanism or an alternative process. It is to assess what responsibility these organizations had apart from, like, say, sending certain troops. They also had a responsibility to ensure the data was being provided by these countries, that whatever responsibility these countries have existed, and to not just issue, say, an advisory or a mandate saying that the distribution of vaccines is not equitable. There's been no tangible fulfillment of their mandates that has happened, and the blame has been shifted on, like, say, non-compliance of member states, which means if there's so much non-compliance, then what is the very point of having these institutions? They fail at the very get-go.
Thank you so much, Samika, for your speech. I'd now like to call upon the opposition speaker from Shri Ram College of Commerce, Aram Mehta, to present their case.
Hi, am I audible and visible?
Yeah, perfectly.
If at any point in time my voice or video breaks, just either put it in the chat or just tell Samika and she'll get it to me, because that might happen. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Greetings to the house at large, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to first of all go ahead and speak to such a distinguished panel. The motion at hand today is whether international organizations have failed in their pandemic response towards their member states. On side opposition, we are very proud to oppose this motion, and we'll tell you why. To fail at any given task, whether that be this debate or fighting a pandemic, you need to have certain responsibilities. So the responsibilities and the authority which is given to these international organizations is not to be an overarching overlord or an authoritative leader who goes ahead and does the work for them. It is to ensure that cooperation and international treaties are, say, fulfilled, and cooperation between member states is something which is ensured. Keeping that in mind, the debate is never about whether the WHO or the United Nations or the European Union was able to meddle into internal workings of member states and then go ahead and say impose lockdowns there, or go ahead and say that follow social distancing. It can only advise them or give them the data which has come to WHO after extenuous research and extenuous cross-checking, so that it's not incorrect data. So the debate is essentially about whether these international organizations, such as the World Health Organization and the UN, were able to coordinate and mobilize international efforts together efficiently and effectively. And we'll tell you why. Taking the case of the most prevalent international organization being the WHO. WHO has been extremely fast and extremely strong in their response, going ahead on 4 parameters. First of all, going ahead and issuing more than 50 pieces of technical guidance, not advices, but technical guidance. Secondly, distributing medical kits, not to only places such as the United States or United Kingdom, but to African countries and countries which, say, like Italy, who were at the onset of the pandemic were extremely short of supply. Thirdly, establishing a supply task force with the World Food Organization to ensure that in countries where lockdown is happening, the shortage of food and the shortage of grains does not exist, and filling in that supply gap. Lastly, raising over $800 million from its member states for the Solidarity Response Fund, which goes ahead and funded very relevant research and development, and also helped poorer countries by giving them economic breaks. Lastly, the idea of a late response by these organizations, such as the WHO, is in retrospect. At that point in time, the data which you gather, which everyone has specified as being independent researchers or individual researchers, is not something a WHO can directly transfer to all its member states or give them advisory. The same data which Taiwan released to WHO was also available to, say, India. So imposing a lockdown in India is the responsibility of leaders elected by the demography there, not by an overarching advisory body. In conclusion, shifting blame on international organizations is something done by weak leaders who have been unsuccessful in their own countries, and confusing the responsibilities of these organizations with the responsibility of these leaders is akin to complaining about the weather when you lose a cricket match. With that, very proud to propose. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much for your speech, Aram. Are there any interjections? Seeing none in the chat. Okay. Anybody else who would like to take an interjection here? Fair enough. Bhargav, you can go ahead with it.
Yes, my interjection to the speaker is that preparing for adversity in that specific area of expertise is the responsibility of that international organization. Point at which we were not prepared and states were not prepared to respond to this pandemic. Why is it not the failure of the organization?
Because taking legislative decisions with respect to the economy and the health of particular citizens is the responsibility of that democracy and the elected leaders of the democracy. That is the difference between what is the responsibility and the authority which they have. A WHO or United Nations doesn't have the authority to take decisions on part of, say, Narendra Modi in India or Donald Trump in the United States. It is and if it did, it would be an authoritative state and not a democratic institution.
Right, thank you very much. I'd now like to call upon the last team for today, ILS Law College. The proposition speaker from ILS, Bhargav Bhamedipati, open the case.
If I can please confirm that I'm clearly audible to everyone.
Yeah, you're audible and visible.
Wonderful. I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. Good afternoon, distinguished members of the panel, and I stand in proposition of the belief that international organizations have failed the world in the pandemic response. Panel will address something that no one has done, which is what is the metric of failure and how do we determine it with respect to international organizations. We think 2 points of important understanding to this extent is needed. First, on the idea that legitimate expectations are kept from these organizations by states and people, and meeting these legitimate expectations is the metric that we should apply. This is primarily because international organizations are made up by these states, means they essentially want these organizations to help and protect them and be their fallback when a situation of adversity arises. Similarly, people always trust their own governments, but believe that maybe these international organizations will help us when necessarily our governments will not be in capacity to help us in the first place. And that is why we think the metric of failure is whether you met those legitimate expectations from the people that were attached to you as an international organization. But secondly, we are not coming here and telling you that WHO is not needed at all and it's a bad organization, right? We're simply telling you that even if you put in efforts, you can fail if you don't meet those legitimate expectations that people are applying to you or expecting from you. That is primarily because failure at the end of the day is embedded in the notion of result, which means you can try, but at a point at which you don't meet those legitimate expectations, you are failing at the end of the day. And this takes us to our constructives on why we have failed in the first place. We think that the first and most intrinsic role or responsibility of an international organization is to foster international cooperation to ensure that their intended goals are achieved in the longer run in the first place. And we think on 3 counts, they have not done that. First, on global preparedness. We do not understand any opposition's engagement with the idea that if I am WHO, my job in the long run is to prepare the world and foster cooperation to ensure that states are capable of responding to adversities such as an outbreak of a pandemic or any disease in the first place. For example, in United Nations, we essentially invest in the military of the United Nations because maybe when peace is threatened and states are not supporting, we'll send that UN military to help us in the adversity. Similarly, as WHO, you are expected to create and foster better response mechanisms in states because in situation of adversity, they should respond. If you never did that, we think you have failed in the first place. And we all agree that we were not ready for the pandemic in the first place, meaning that WHO has failed to a great degree. But secondly, on the idea of unity and solidarity, we think at a point at which vaccine nationalism, ideas of like essentially not providing healthcare facilities in regions where most needed and delaying responses are just ideas on how we have just failed to foster relationships and solidarity in countries, especially on issues like health and pandemic. And lastly, we think that the mandate at least needs to be fulfilled. If WHO recognized COVID as public emergency later, or UNSC never took measures to protect poor nations, we think they never even actualized the mandate that was granted. Thus, on the metric that organizations fails to foster global preparedness, promote unity and solidarity, and actualize their own mandate, we think they've failed the world in their COVID response. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that speech. There are two interjections. I take up the interjection of Devashish from Nirma University.
Or any international organization force the state to do something when compulsion is not even in their mandate as per agreed by all the countries at large? Don't consider us other teams who never actually engage with you. We're actually engaging with you when we're telling you that maybe you didn't need to compulsory bind China into doing something. But the point at which you never fostered medical responses into countries that were weaker, poorer, etc., even before the pandemic, so that infectious diseases don't destroy entire nations. I think you've failed as an entire organization because that was the only job entrusted to you by the states and the people in the first place.
Right. Thank you so much, Bhargav, for that wonderful speech. Now, I'd like to call upon the final speaker for today's debate, Tushar Rajput from ILS Law College, to conclude the debate and oppose the motion.
Could you please confirm if I'm both audible and visible?
Yeah, you're both audible and visible.
All right. Could you just give me a moment? Yeah. I'll start in 3, 2, 1, go. This House believes that international organizations have failed the world in the pandemic response. Certainly not. Greetings, fellow debaters and esteemed judges. This is Tushar Rajput from the side opposition. As one considers the role of international organizations play in the international arena and the role they might play if they were given greater autonomy and authority, it is difficult to escape the sense that more is possible. But like any other human institutions, international organizations are imperfect. They make mistakes, but they also offer the promise of helping to overcome the enormous status quo bias that is built onto international community's commitment to consent. Simply put, states have not been bold enough when assigning authority to these bodies and have now been blunt enough to view the actions of these organizations in the dark. Panel, it is crucial for the members to understand that not being able to achieve the end goal of an international organization is not the metric of failure, because it is simply altruistic that an organization would do all that it intended to. But the metric in this case is whether it was able to provide unique solutions and expand its mandate and operation to meet its intended goals. Because if yes, then its intent is a success because the organization did far more better than it has previously done. My worthy speakers from the side proposition comes up and argues that misinformation, lack in research is the primary problem, along with the element of timely response. Lessons learned from Ebola outbreak response in West Africa and most recently in Democratic Republic of Congo have demonstrated that the co-construction of socio-cultural solutions has fostered the commitments of the affected communities and has succeeded in enhancing the community engagement and the ownership of WHO's response within the same. But moreover, this idea that the novel nature of virus does definitely call for an uncertainty. In research, or the same shouldn't be seen as a failure, because feats such as developing a large-scale vaccine production within a short span of time and engaging a response mechanism for the same is a feat that has not been achieved before, and we need to appreciate these international organizations for the same. The question here is, what would an ideal pandemic response look like? It is relatively easier for us to point the same at this point, but 15 months back, the novel element would have distorted everyone's judgment. And now imagine 193 people suggesting that their own ideas to go about the same. It is a difficult position to be in, right? Given the limited authority and mandate when we take the decision that did make the situation miles better than it is today, why wouldn't a deference be granted to such international organizations owing to the decisions and the responses and the situation in which they carried out such a comprehensive plan that we are part of today? And in the case of international organizations such as WHO, asking them to be able to respond to such pandemic in a short notice and then continuing the response mechanism even when the world was in such shutdown is inherently way above the reasonable expectations. There was an interesting point regarding complementarity and cooperation brought in. We think that community engagement and co-constructions are two complementary notions that are part here. The first being the end of the process, and the second being the method or step to achieve the desired goal. An international organization in this case have showcased their comprehensive within both these parameters. We think that handful of these organizations are faced with accusations of mismanagement and hypocrisy, but it potentially creates a negative reputational spillover for everyone. And this undermines the legitimacy of such organizations and raises questions about their abilities. And for these reasons, we are proud to oppose in the case. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tushar. Are there any interjections for Tushar's speech? Fair. I don't see any interjections. So, right, Samika, please make your interjection very quick. Please go ahead.
Really quickly, you talked about how there's been like an expansion of the responsibilities of, say, these international organizations, and you say that they've been like releasing data, but if this data is false, then is that not more of a hindrance than a help to the pandemic response?
And that is precisely why they would take their time in order to make sure that the data at least that comes out is the one that is rightly projected. But at the same time, an element of deference still needs to be granted, because there is an element of novelty to the entire virus. Even if today I say that something stands to be true based on the research that we conduct at this point of time, and owing to the fact that we are 1 year down the lane, we still have various variants of COVID still coming out in the world, and it's still creating a problem. In that case, it is reasonable to grant such deference to such owing to the limited research, limited experience, and novelty of the virus in this case.
Thank you so much, Tushar. With this, we come to the end of the final round of the third annual Sanjay Srivastava Memorial Debate. Thank you so much for that wonderful debate, participants. It was extremely enriching and fascinating to hear your arguments and how you analyze them to your respective sides. That being said, the judges will now move to deliberation on the verdict. Teams are please requested to stay on call as we wait for our chief guest to join us. Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Shakti Sinha. Happy to be here. Thank you, Dr. Sanjay Srivastava. Thank you, Deepika, also. Particularly Deepika, not also, particularly Deepika, for allowing me to be here. And of course, I can see both kids here, Alexita and Amit. You know, when I joined Hindu College in 1973, for many of you, the students, your parents were probably in school. I'm just joking, but you're possibly correct, actually. We had two heroes when we joined college in 73. One was our chief guest for today, Hardeep Puri, who had broken all kinds of records in BA and MA, and you know, in those days for Hindu college to be talking to the university in history was considered amazing. And the other was somebody who became very close to me, the late Sanjay Srivastava, Ben. It was on and Ben again had said literally a meteor blazing through the skies, you know. Glad you debated a subject as important for us as per the international organizations like the WHO have failed or not. If you can hear me again, can somebody confirm that you can hear me?
Yes, yes, Shakti, we can.
Good, good. There was a music group called, what was it? Pink Floyd, an album called The Dark Side of the Moon. And Ben Srivastava debated the subject in St. Stephen's College at the Mukherjee Memorial. This house believes in the dark side of the moon. That is the kind of cerebral stuff that Ben said for all of us. So when I see this being carried on, I see the amount of effort that Deepika family is doing for this. I think it's very, very moving. You know, I think really this is the kind of way that DPI respects those who guided us in different ways, and I think who continue to guide us, whether they're physically with us or not. So all I can say is thank you very, very much for allowing me to be here. Our chief guest again, Hardeep, I don't know whether he's here or not, Hardeep Puri, our minister, amazing debaters. Again, as I said, and I can see Mr. Puri is here, he didn't join in when I spoke. I mentioned that when we joined Hindu College, we had two icons to follow. One was Hardeep Puri, the other was Ben Srivastava. From Mumbai, from there, who joined us. This is the kind of standards that we must aim for. Push ourselves against. So once again, thank you very much. And now starting debate. Thank you, Deepika.
Paul.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I'm now delighted to welcome our chief guest for today.
And your judges, one of the judges was a very strong debater along with Nita Chaudhary. So you are in very good company of being judged by the very best. And Rajan, of course. Rajan.
Right. Thank you, sir. We will now be beginning with the closing ceremony for the third annual Sanjay Srivastava Memorial Debate. I hope everyone had an exciting time witnessing the debate earlier today. It is now my pleasure and privilege to welcome our chief guest for today, the Honorable Minister Shri Hardeep Singh Puri. Mr. Puri is the Union Minister of State for Housing and Urban Affairs, Civil Aviation, and the Minister of State for Commerce and Industry. He has had a distinguished 4-decade career in diplomacy, spanning the bilateral and multilateral arena, having held ambassadorial posts in London, Brazil, and as India's permanent representative to the United Nations in both Geneva and New York. He is one of the few Indians to preside over the United Nations Security Council and the only one to have chaired its Counter-Terrorism Committee. He served as Chairman RIS, as Vice President at the International Peace Institute, and as Secretary General of the Independent Commission on Multilateralism in New York. In addition to this, Sir is also the author of 3 books. But perhaps what makes this even more special for us is the fact that we are welcoming back an old alumni who, at his time at Hindu, was not only a keen debater, but also a prolific student leader and an outstanding scholar. Therefore, it seems befitting to welcome Sir to celebrate the life of someone who too, throughout his time at Hindu and in professional service, exemplified the highest standards of conduct and service. Before moving on, I would want to do a quick recap of everything that has happened today for this edition of this debate. This year, the Sanjay Srivastava Memorial Debate was conducted in the Oxford format of debating, with each team comprising of 2 speakers, one speaking for and one speaking against the motion. While organizing this debate virtually, we had the benefit of hosting teams from across India. And earlier today, many of these teams competed in 2 different pools in a qualifying rounds in a prelim for which the motions read, this House would make vaccine passports compulsory for international travel. After an intense qualifying round, we then had 6 teams making it to the grand finals. The finalists for this edition of this debate were St. Xavier's College, Mumbai, Institute of Law, Nirma University, ILS Law College, Sri Ram College of Commerce, Miranda House, and Hansraj College. These teams competed in the finals where the proposition had to defend the motion, this House believes that international organizations have failed the world in their pandemic response. We were grateful to Ms. Nita Chaudhary and Sri Ranjan Chatterjee for being the judges for this final debate. I would now welcome our principal, Professor Anju Srivastava, to address the gathering.
Thank you, Sir Vinay. I'm sorry for my bad throat and generally not feeling too well. Honorable Minister of State Housing and Urban Affairs, Minister of State Civil Aviation and Minister of State Commerce and Industry, Sri Hardeep Singh Puri ji, guests of honor Sri Shakti Sinha ji, Madam Neeta Chaudhary and Sri Ranjan Chatterjee, Chairman Governing Body Hindu College Sri TCA Rangachari ji, distinguished and our very loving alumni, Madam Deepika Srivastav, her family members, faculty advisor of the Debating Society, Dr. Devasya, faculty members, participants from various institutions from Delhi and outside, students and ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Hindu College and my own behalf, I extend a very warm welcome to you all to this concluding session of the third annual Sanjay Srivastava Memorial Debate. It is indeed an honor to have Amit Sas, the Honorable Minister, who heads the key ministries that are both central to transformational programs being implemented by the government, including Swachh Bharat and smart cities, in addition to being arterial to our fight against this pandemic. Sir is playing an instrumental role in navigating both this immediate crisis as well as helping set us on a better path over the long term. But for us Hinduites, as already Savinay has said, the greatest pride is that Sir Shri Puri is our own alumnus. He did his BA honors in history and MA in history from this college. And he was the Prime Minister of the college parliament, was a keen debater who made a mark in the entire university for his elocution skills. It is therefore only apt that we have Dr. Puri here today at this prestigious event in the memory of Sri Sanjay Srivastava, who embodied the spirit of public service and conversation that Puri sir has championed through the course of his life as a student, as a diplomat, and now as a member of parliament. We are also privileged to have Shakti Sinha sir. I don't know whether he's there at the moment, but really great to have him to take out time because his presence has given tremendous energy and drive to the students. As always, we are extremely grateful to Srimati Neeta Chaudhary and Ranjan Chatterjee sir for taking out time from their schedules to grace this occasion and judge this event. At this time, I would like to congratulate the participants for an absorbing session of debating. All of you have given us a lot to think about and have put forth ideas and arguments that will be remembered and recalled well beyond this session. Today's event has been a special celebration of the legacy of one of our most distinguished alumni, Sanjay Srivastava ji, a brilliant student inside the classroom and a natural leader outside the classroom. Sri Sanjay Srivastava ji was an extraordinary member of the Hindu community. He made lasting contributions to his academic field and student life at Hindu, including leading the organization of one of the most favorite programs that the college has annually, which is Mecca. Several generations of Hinduites after him have benefited from his work, and his memory today serves as a reminder of the high standards and expectations that all of us today in the Hindu community must live up to. Sri Sanjay Srivastava went on to perform pivotal roles at various levels of the government as a member of the Indian Administrative Services. He took Hindu's name to higher pedestals with his various significant contributions in the public sphere. Today, by engaging with contrarian ideas and opinions with mutual respect, the participants have shown us a great example of the value of discussion and dialogue. They have truly paid tribute to the legacy of Sri Sanjay Srivastava. He would be very proud of the level of nuance and rigor in today's debate. Once again, I would like to congratulate all the participants for a splendid debate and thank all our special guests and everybody who has joined for their presence. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for that speech. I would now like to invite our judge and our guest of honor, Ms. Neeta Chaudhary, to address the gathering.
Thank you very much. First of all, a little about Sanjay. When I joined college in 1972 in LSR, Sanjay was already an established speaker in Hindu College. And he was one person with whom I had personal friendship, but a very keen debating rivalry. Shortly after that, Sanjay's wife joined LSR, Deepika. And she also became a very, very good friend of mine. I also have the privilege of knowing his daughters and his son. His daughter is now the famous cine producer, director, story writer, Alankrita Srivastava. I think most of you must be knowing her from her films and the guts she has shown to produce them. Among the people who are present here today, the chief guest is a person who we've heard about as one of the most distinguished speakers of Hindu College, the Honorable Minister. Shakti Sinha was also a powerful speaker, as was Pradeep Puri. In the course of time, we've had very, very friendly and good relations, but splendid competition with Hindu. And all I can say is, as the principal has just said, Sanjay Srivastava has done yeoman service to the debating community of Hindu College and Delhi University. And I personally miss him very much, both as a colleague and as a fellow debater. I wish this debate all success. On the debate itself, I would just like to say two things. The level of the debate was uniformly good. And all the speakers tried to put some points forward. The speakers who won the prize according to the judges, they were the ones who deviated a bit from the normal and put forward points which have won them the debate. You know, the principle of debating is not to tell us facts, but it is to convince us of your line of argument. And that is what I think the two debaters have done. I wish all the best to the debating society. I thank the principal and I thank everybody who is associated with this great art of debating, because this is the only way in which, right from the time of Aristotle, Socrates, and Plato, the world has gone forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. I would now like to invite Mr. Ranjan Chatterjee, our second guest, and our second judge and our guest of honor to address the gathering.
It's been a very lively debate, and the first interesting discussion on a subject which is so much torn apart by different points of view. And it is in the fitness of things that we are doing it under the aegis of Sanjay Srivastava's legacy. We are all proud to be a part of it. He's done great honors to the college and to the country in the different hats that he has worn all his life. And I have known his wife also when we were working in the planning commission together. But coming back to the debate, it's been indeed wonderful to have heard so many distinguished speakers. Each one of them had something to contribute. And very often we were finding it difficult to, to be able to evaluate. But then one of the tasks of a judge is to be judgmental, when you are asked to do so. So therefore, we are not shy of doing so, and we have selected. So may we announce it now or later, Anita?
I don't know, sir. The organizers have to decide.
Sir, we have requested. Sir, we have requested our chief guest, Honorable Minister, sir, to do the announcement, sir.
Very well.
So he has very kindly consented.
Very well. Very well. I think on that note, I would like to end by expressing my gratitude and thanks for being a part of this wonderful institution, and in a small way to be part of the Hindu College tradition. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for those kind words. I would now like to invite our chief guest for the day, the Honorable Minister, Shri Hardeep Singh Puri, to first address the gathering.
Let me start by thanking Anju and Deepika, who I believe are responsible for this invitation for me to be a part of the 3rd annual Sanjay Srivastava Memorial Debate. I'm very happy to be amongst old friends this afternoon. I'm sorry, Ranjan, I've deprived you and Neeta of the pleasure of announcing the results, but I would have been equally happy if either you or Neeta had done so. Let me start again by underlining that whilst we are celebrating a very distinguished former student of Hindu College, somebody who excelled in different areas in his years at the university and later in his professional life. For me personally, he was a close friend. He was a part and for a long time a leader of what we call the Bihari Brigade. I have several distinguished members of that group. I can see them on the screen. Sanjay had human qualities which made him stand out in a group. Even though I was a few years ahead of him in the university, we became the closest of friends. He had many firsts to his credit. He topped the university and thereby hangs a tale. If you permit me to be candid, I'll also tell you, I'll share this with you. He stood first in the university. He topped in the IAS examination. I think the year was 1977. And I could recount many firsts that he had to his credit. But more than anything else, he was a first-rate human being. When he and Deepika started seeing each other, I remember a conversation we had, I don't remember the context, and I expressed the hope that he would be joining the Indian Foreign Service since he was expected to do well in the IAS exam, which he demonstrated by topping the list. And he gave me a long spiel how the nation needed his services and that how he was going to devote himself to, the service of the country and so on and so forth. I tried to argue with him that Samaj Seva and serving the country can also be done in other walks of life. I even recounted the case of somebody who had appeared for the IAS examination in the year of the Lord, I think 1958 or something. And the UPSC board asked him a question. I perhaps should not take the gentleman's name because his son is now a very distinguished senior member of the Foreign Service. And he said, Mr. So-and-so, why do you want to join the Foreign Service? So he said, sir, this is the only profession I know of where you can combine patriotism with residence abroad. lo and behold, he was selected not because of that answer, but because I think he had an all-round good score, both in the written and in the interview. There are some things about Sanjay that I cannot share in this polite audience, because that would amount to breach of privilege amongst, we were then young adults. So, but I think, and that's also what is not required. But I can tell you one incident when Sanjay appeared for his third-year examination in the university, and he would come out and say that, I've done very well. He was confident. He had prepared. He had an angle on everything, and he had ended up doing. What he did not realize was that the examiner of the Modern Indian History paper at the BA Honours level happened to be a very close friend of mine. And as some examiners are, he wanted a second opinion on some of the grading that he had done. And since I was a close friend of Sanjay's, I could recognize his handwriting. And when I saw the paper, I realized that he had not done the fifth question. So he kept asking me. So when I saw the grading, I agreed with the examiner's grading. He did very well in the first 4 questions, but he had really not attempted the fifth question. But Sanjay, that was Sanjay, full of confidence, very sure of his scholarship, of his ability to communicate. So I kept asking him, I said, how did you do in the Modern Indian History paper? He said, I did brilliantly. I said, are you sure? I mean, I never told him till his results came out. Then he came to me, he said, how did you know? And I didn't even tell him. Today I'm sharing this because I said, was the grade correct? He said, grade was correct because I had only really attempted 4 questions. But I'll put that aside. I'm delighted to be here, not only because we are celebrating Sanjay Srivastav, dear friend, a distinguished student of Hindu College, somebody who did well in all walks of life, but not only because Deepika is a close friend. I'm afraid because I moved on in life and spent my years elsewhere, I don't have the privilege of knowing the family, but I'm sure we will have an opportunity to meet the children and welcome them back into our fold. The subject that you have chosen for this final segment of this evening's debate, this House believes that international organizations have failed the world in their pandemic responses. I'm sorry, I did not have an opportunity to listen to the interaction, the debate itself, because I had another meeting and I joined late. But let me share a few comments on this. My senior colleague, the very famous Shri Rangachari, who's the chairman of the governing body, is, I'm sure, joined with us. And he knows this better than anyone else. The current global architecture, which is anchored in the United Nations, the multilateral system, anchored in the UN, which includes the IMF, World Bank, etc. This architecture was conceptualized and implemented whilst the Second World War was still raging. When the international community met in 1945 in San Francisco and drafted the charter, they were able to do so partly because the Second World War was raging and they needed to come up with a new architecture soon. For many of us, like Ranga, who have worked in the multilateral system, both in New York, Geneva, and elsewhere, we have said for a long time that the multilateral system devised in 1945 today is clearly outdated. It does not have the capacity to respond to the challenges. And I'm not saying this now in 2020 or 2021, when the pandemic has reared its ugly head. I said this even when the global financial and economic crisis hit in 2008, because the institutional structures which were devised in 1945 in the UN, ECOSOC, to deal with the financial and economic crisis, clearly it was inadequate. The IMF, the World Bank, none of them knew how to deal with something that happened in 2008 and 9. And therefore, the G8 was born at summit level and became the G20, because you needed a summit level group of heads of state and government to be able to address fundamental challenges of that kind. Now I come back to the subject of today's debate. International organizations have failed us. First of all, let me start by saying, if this is intended as an indictment of the World Health Organization, the subject will have many takers. The WHO has been criticized severely for its shortcomings. It was late in acknowledging the source and the intensity of the pandemic. As ambassador to the and permanent representative to the UN in Geneva, New York, I've had the privilege of dealing with many pandemics: SARS, Ebola, H1N1, or what is called swine flu. SARS had a mortality rate of 17%, whereas COVID, at the best of times, even in its most severest form, has had a mortality rate of only about 2%. But the COVID-19 reminds us of the Spanish flu, which hit the world in 1918, in which case also the second wave was the most devastating and severe. The limited point I'm taking is these international organizations were all devised well after the Spanish flu. They were devised in the aftermath of the Second World War. And I think the need for reform and need to redo these international organizations, that time has come. If we are talking about institutions other than the WHO, again, I think the UN itself, the IMF, the World Bank, everybody needs to take stock of the situation, that the global power balance, the geopolitical reality, and the fact that if you have a situation in which hundreds and thousands of people are going to be afflicted by the virus on a daily basis, and you have a mortality rate of the kind that you do. In India, we were under the impression that we had successfully dealt with the first wave. We had, but then I think behavioral issues, people throwing caution to the winds. Even now, the problem is not vaccinating everyone. I mean, you can. I mean, if you want to ramp up production and you want to, that's not efficient use of resources. The fundamental thing that needs to be done is that you have to ensure that even after you have overcome these challenges for a long time to come, the new normal is going to be SOPs, social distancing, and precautions of the kind that you need to take till you are 100% sure that everybody has been vaccinated, or that the virus itself has, metamorphed into something with a very low disruption causing potential. Therefore, I am very happy that the organizers of this debate have chosen to consider a proposition which I think is on everybody's mind. I think in India in particular, I've always said that the kind of society that we will be determined always by the nature of the intellectual discourse that we have. Now, when Shakti, I saw him on the screen, I don't know whether he's still there, just after I had come back, and he had invited me to deliver a talk at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. I had spoken in terms of I had spoken about the Western liberal democratic order and the decline and the passing away. And I think one of the great things about our country, and something on which my friends on the liberal left have been a little apologetic and perhaps for reasons I don't understand, is the great capacity for us to not only think, to conceptualize, but also to prepare and advance recipes and recommendations which the world had followed. I remember in that talk at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, I talked about all the praise showered on Indian thinking by philosophers over hundreds of years. Today, this pandemic is giving us an opportunity to reinvent ourselves. We were already the pharmacy of the world when we started producing generics in large numbers. But I think we are now in the game, and I think our vaccine production is in the coming few weeks going to receive a massive boost, because we are going to have licensed production of a large number of other vaccine also for supply, not only here, but we've already supplied 65 lakh doses, I think, outside. Not 65, more. Yes, 65 lakhs doses outside. We'll be supplying many more. And this is the new reordering of the globe which is taking place. And I think a discussion of a proposition like this provides the capacity to look at the new coordinates of what a world post-pandemic will be. I don't have the time and you don't have the patience, I'm sure, but I think the new normal is going to be defined by a number of factors. One of them will be that beware, you are now, I hope we don't get into this habit, because working virtually can be infectious. You can be lazy, you can sit at home and do 10 VCs, but it doesn't have that quality of interacting. I would love to meet up with some of my friends, the distinguished judges, ask them how, they're members of their family whom I've had the privilege of knowing how they are, where they are, but which you can only do through physical meetings. But thank you very much once again. And sorry, Ranjan, I deprived you of this, but the results which I have been asked to read out on behalf of Neeta and Ranjan, the best speaker from the opposition is Khush Dhembla from Hansraj College. Congratulations, best speaker against the motion. The best speaker for the motion is Bhargav Bhamritipati from ILS Law School, Pune. Congratulations to both the best speakers. I would recommend to the organizers of this debate, I don't know how long the speakers spoke for, but I think you should make video clips of those two speeches and have them put out on social media. And I'd be very happy to have my social media team, boost those because I think it's a proposition, and to have young minds speak on this. So heartiest congratulations to both the best speaker from the opposition and the best speaker for the motion. The third best team is Nirma University. The second best team is ILS Law School, Pune. And the winner for today's debate is Hansraj College. Now, I have known both Ranjan and Neeta for many, many years. They may not choose even to acknowledge that because, and I'm very conscious because I'd say, oh, I've known you since so-and-so, but they might get retorts saying, but I'm not that old. That happens all the time. But what I'm saying is, I know them both extremely fair. So there is no way that the campus proximity between Hindu College and Hansraj College could have played any role in this. So my heartiest congratulations to all the winners, the winning teams, and more than that, to the two speakers. And once again, thank you, Deepika. I know how much effort goes into this. And apart from, serving a very useful legacy purpose for my friend Ben, I think this platform also uniquely serves the very useful purpose of bringing some old friends together. I saw many people on the screen fleetingly, and I think I'm hoping that by next year, we would be able to refer to this pandemic in the past tense. And maybe next year when we have a physical debate, after the debate is done, maybe I'd like to host all of you over at home in order to carry this process forward of celebrating our friend. Thank you very much, and congratulations to all of you all once again. Thank you.
Through the organizers, I just want to say one thing. I'd heard about you, sir, very much, but this extempore speech of today has floored me. Thank you.
I second Nita completely.
Really beautiful, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for those kind words. I would now like to invite our faculty advisor, Dr. Devasya M. Anthony, to kindly deliver the vote of thanks.
Devasya ji, please unmute yourself.
Sorry, thank you. Thank you, Sanyam. Honorable Minister, Sri Hardeep Singh Puri ji, guests of honor, Sri Shakti Sinha ji, Madam Nida Chaudhary ji, Sri Ranjan Chatterjee, Sri Rankachar ji, the governing body chairperson, Madam Deepika Srivastava ji, Madam Principal, Professor Anju Srivastava ji, Madam Vice Principal Rina Jain, esteemed guests, and the students who participate in the debate. As I see, the debate continues, because T.S. Eliot has said, we shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive at where we started and to know the place for the first time. I've listened to some of the debaters, it's fantastic, and they forced each of us to revisit our thoughts. And I'm really happy to propose the vote of thanks. First and foremost, our heartfelt thanks goes to you, Honorable Minister Sri Hardeep Singh Puri ji, for coming out of the college and telling us that this college bears a stamp in your heart as well as in your mind. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Sri Shakti Sinha ji, a guest of honor, thank you so much. You spoke before the minister spoke. I could hear that your friendship with Sri Srivastava in your time at Hindu College and the way he has influenced your thinking. Thank you so much for being here. The judge and the special invitee guest of honor, Madam Nida Chaudhary, thank you so much for coming and putting in that soul flavor into this debate and judging the debate by listening to everybody. Thank you, Sri Ranjan Chatterjee, for being here and for recollecting your experiences with Mr. Srivastava ji. Sri Rankachar ji, the governing body chairperson, thank you so much for being present amidst us. You have given us that impetus to look forward. Madam Deepika Srivastava ji, thank you so much. It is your periodic impetus that brings us to celebrate the memory of this soulful person of the college in a fresh ways every time. Though this time is not most conducive. And I remember that your effort, along with the principal ma'am and the college, vice principal ma'am, all of the college, it tells us that when the going gets tough, the tough get going. Thank you so much for being with us. Professor Anju Srivastava, Madam Principal, thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here, taking us, all of us along, and being part of this wonderful mindful exercise. Madam Vice Principal Rina Jain, thank you so much for being here. And my wonderful team of DevSoc, led by Savane Sharma. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here. As I said, the debate continues, and we shall see in the coming year. Thank you so much. Namaskar and Jai Hind.
Thank you, sir. With that, we come to the end of today's function. I thank everyone who joined us and made this event a success, in particular the teams and the judges and every other guest that joined us. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Savine and everybody. Very, very
Thank you, Savine. Thank you.
Thanks, Ranjan sir. Thanks, Nita ma'am. Everybody, thank you very much. Namaskar.